Hi, in this short video I'm going to talk about the origins of the short story. In the next 2 or 3 weeks in this course you will be reading various short stories. I hope you enjoy them, but let's talk today about where the whole idea of the short story came from. So in our course you'll see under PowerPoints a section titled The Short Story. And for most of the short stories that you are assigned, there is a PowerPoint that goes along with it. So I encourage you to view those. Today I'm going to focus on this particular PowerPoint, the PowerPoint dealing with the short story, and tell you a little bit about the origins of that approach to literature. So the short story is a relatively recent mode of fiction as fiction goes. Fiction has a long history, usually beginning in the oral tradition, where much of the earliest stories were told in the form of tales, perhaps told around a campfire where people sat around and shared stories or ideas for entertainment. Later, stories were also used as a way of keeping up with culture or history and documenting major events. But the short story, as we encounter it in this particular course, has an origin that evolved much later. What is a short story? That's the first question. By definition, a short story is a brief, imaginative narrative containing few characters, usually just a few, one or two, a simple plot, a simple conflict, uh, an element of suspense, which leads to a climax and a swift conclusion. Most short stories can be read in one sitting. The word fiction derives from the Latin word fingere, meaning to fashion or form, and the word story and history share a common root, the Latin word historia, which means a presumably true account of events. So with these ideas came the notion of what eventually became the short story. Today, fiction can be divided into many contemporary genres. We have horror fiction, spy fiction, romantic fiction, action, apocalyptic fiction, post apocalyptic fiction. There's all kinds of subcategories of fiction, and these subcategories can help define the various short stories that we will encounter. The earliest short story or the genre of the short story came from early influences, which includes parables, fables, folk tales, and ballads. The development of the short story is largely a development of the 19th century. That's the 1800s. And this was a carefully contrived literary form closely related to the rise of many popular publications. So you can see that in the 1800s, with the invention of the printing press and the fact that more and more people were becoming educated, more people were moving to urban locations and away from rural locations, and with the increase in employment and education, uh, came the rise of the middle class, and the middle class sought out forms of entertainment, and that gap was filled with many publications that circulated and could be subscribed to, like the New Yorker. So these magazines, some of them are still published today, could be purchased at newsstands or delivered to an individual on a regular basis, usually monthly or bi-monthly. And in those, one of the forms of entertainment that became immensely popular was the short story, usually published in the early magazines in serial publications. That means that, for instance, if you were to read Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Telltale Heart, you might receive part of that story in one edition of the New Yorker, and then the rest of the story in a future edition. So you had to wait. But this form of entertainment became immensely popular in the 19th century. That's the 1800s. Some of the early writers in the American tradition of the short story include Washington Irving. He's probably considered the first most important American short story writer. He laid the foundation for the development of the short story. He's best known for two pieces, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. Nathaniel Hawthorne is also an early American short story writer. He was quite prolific in his writing over 100 short stories and sketches. He's best known for the short story The Scarlet Letter. Of course, Edgar Allan Poe influenced the short story, and Poe gave us the first definition of the short story. Poe, and you may not know this, though he wrote many macabre poems and short stories, was best known for his literary criticism, and he examined lots of literature of the time and wrote his thoughts down, and these thoughts were widely published. And one of the things that Poe observed is that many of the early short stories or shorter fiction was sometimes very wordy, very descriptive. And so Poe began to contemplate that, and he created a theory, basically a principle of all art. He called it the principle of artistic unity. And in this theory, he laid out his ideas of what really made a good short story. This definition became hugely influential in many of the short stories that followed the writings of Edgar Allan Poe and still influences writers today. Poe's theory of artistic unity can be paraphrased here. Poe's essential characteristic of the short story can be summed up in three ways. Poe said that a good short story should be brief, that is, it should be able to be read in a single sitting. He also believed that a good short story should show unity. That means that everything contributes to the overall function of the story. There's no extra language, there's no extra detail. Everything contributes to the story as a whole. And that it should be intense. Poe's definition of artistic unity, again paraphrase, is that the condition of a successful literary work whereby all its elements, everything in the story, works together for the achievement of its central purpose. In an artistically unified work, nothing is included that is irrelevant to the central purpose, nothing is omitted that is essential to it, and the parts are arranged in the most effective order for the achievement of that. In the 19th and 20th centuries, that's the 18 and 1900s, there were many common themes that begin to develop as part of the short story genre. Anxiety, doubt, frustration, restlessness, modern war, space exploration, computer technology, social criticism, psychological maladjustment, the breakdown of the human relationship, philosophical searching, uh, unhappy people, lost guidepost of conduct and morality. So you can see, especially if you think of the 19th and 20th centuries historically, that this is an era that was situated between two major world wars, the failure of the stock market. And so, with these historical situations, it impacted much of what writers wrote about and how they express themselves. So you can see that these themes, no doubt, were a part of those circumstances of, for writers, and they portrayed these ideas through their writing. Anxiety, doubt, frustration, modern war. These were relatively new uh, issues, and so writers often reflected those concerns through the stories that they created. In contemporary America, short stories might include some of the previous themes, but they will also sometimes tend to focus on the impact of harried American society on the inner lives of its people. In other words, many Americans feel overburdened by all the expectations in society, and so some of the writing may reflect this type of burden. Stories from the 1960s to the 1980s are often called postmodern. Postmodern fiction deals with the overturning of accepted definitions of and values about existing systems of education, religion, legislation, economy, or any other aspect of society. Two stories with postmodern themes are Graham Greene's The Destructors and Eudora Welty's Everyday Use. Short stories typically have different elements that we will talk about throughout this course. These elements will apply to short stories, the novel, and some of them even poetry and drama, but they might apply in a little bit of a different way depending on what kind of literature we're currently discussing. So for a short story, you can discuss short stories in terms of plot, character, setting, point of view, language, tone, style, theme, symbol, and structure. None of these elements operate in isolation. Each element allows the reader to understand how the story functions as a whole. Examining such elements allows the reader to understand the stories. In other words, by examining these individual elements, you might have a better idea of the story's context. That means the situation that surrounds the story, why it was created, what motivated the writer to write the information that you're reading or the story that you're reading, the form, physical form of the story on the paper, the craft, maybe certain characteristics of the writer and how they do what they do, in the writer's voice. When reading fiction, including short stories in college, it's important that you become a critical reader. Critical reading is important in studying any kind of literature. You must actively engage with the story. In other words, while you're reading, you should be asking questions of the text, highlighting repetitive information, circling words perhaps that you don't know, taking the time to go further beyond the text and look for that information. Perhaps in some cases, you will need to be willing to investigate the context or whatever inspired the writer to write what they do. If you fail to do some of these items, take the time to really invest in the text, you're going to miss some of the purpose and intent of that text for the reader. So as you read, ask important questions of the text. Does the main character do what is expected? Why or why not? Does the author follow a logical order, or do they do something different? How does the title inform or impact the story? Are there any words or ideas that are repeated? When we study fiction or short stories, we might also talk about fiction in terms of genre. There are many different types of genre that we can talk about that exist today: romance, crime, fantasy, horror, spy, western, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic. These are different approaches, thematic approaches to literature. So what does reading give us? Tim O'Brien says that stories console me. If I'm lying in bed at night, I'm a little less alone in my lonely universe. Stories connect me to not just other people, but also to myself. Reading fiction gives us an opportunity to examine our own lives by comparison. When reading fiction, you must pay careful attention to the elements that the author has placed before you. One of those elements could be setting. This includes the time, the place, the period in which the story takes place. It might include a geographical location. It might include a specific time period. It might suggest a certain socioeconomic characteristic of the location, or it might be something even more specific like a building or a room. Setting does many things for an author. In some cases, a setting can help in the portrayal of a character. So, for instance, if you're reading certain bits of fiction, it might be that the setting is actually described by the author, but the setting itself has something to do with either the physical or psychological workings of a particular character. Setting in some works of fiction is so closely related to, or in some works of fiction, action is so closely related to setting that the plot is directed by it. A great example of this is George Orwell, 1984, when Orwell writes early in the novel, "It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13." Now, we know as a reader that clocks don't strike 13. We also associate 13 with misfortune. So, in the setting that's described here, you know instantly as a reader that something is amiss, that this isn't the normal, everyday circumstances that we're used to being a part of. And so, through setting, George Orwell directs you into a plot that deals with a world in the future where things have changed to the point where in some cases, technology and government are threatening people's individuality. SETI can establish the atmosphere of a work as well. Uh, in A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, he starts out writing, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." That gives the reader an indication of something of the setting, that times were really good. And indeed, in this story, times are really good for some people, but it could also be the worst of times for others. There are also types of characters in short stories: round characters, dynamic characters, flat characters, static characters. So a round character is a more convincing character. They have many different characteristic traits that are described by the author. A dynamic character can be a round character, but it's a little more. This is a character that undergoes some type of change in a story because of something that happens. In a short story, the dynamic character is usually also the protagonist, or in some cases, the hero. A flat character is a stereotyped, shallow, often symbolic character. I always think of Darth Vader. When I think of a flat character, he represents evil, he's dark, he's mysterious, his visage is always covered, he's unemotional, and he's pretty consistent throughout all of the Star Wars movies. He's a flat character. He doesn't really change or undergo any kind of transition. We always know what to expect from Darth Vader. Flat characters can also be static characters, and these are characters that don't change in the course of a story. Characters can also be divided into the protagonist and the antagonist as a way of talking about characters. The protagonist is often the main character in a literary work. It can be a hero, it could be an anti hero, but it is usually the central character of a piece of work. The protagonist is often a dynamic character that shows some kind of change. The antagonist isn't always so obvious. This is the character in the piece of literature that opposes the protagonist. They're not necessarily evil, uh, and their protest isn't necessarily something that is grand or easily understood. So you have to look carefully for the antagonist in some literary pieces. Methods of characterization. There are two different methods of characterization. An author can use a direct characterization where he literally or she literally tells you what the character looks like, how the character thinks, what the character is doing. A great example of this is the characterization of the old man by Ernest Hemingway in The Old Man and the Sea. In the quote to the right, you can see that this is a direct characterization when Hemingway writes of the old man that he no longer dreamed of storms, nor of women, nor of great occurrences, nor of great fish, nor fights, nor contests of strength, nor of his wife. So Hemingway is telling you exactly what to think or what to know about this character. This is direct characterization. Authors might also use indirect characterization, where they just allow the character to participate in or interact in the story, and the reader is left to make observations of the character and come up with who the character is as a person. Short stories have a basic plot structure. They have a beginning, rising action, some sort of single climactic point, falling action where things are beginning to be resolved. and then the end where everything is wrapped up, also known as a resolution. This is an example of the plot structure of a short story where I'm giving you a little more detail about the climax, the rising action, the exposition, the falling action, and the resolution. Elements of the plot. So within the plot, there are elements that drive the short story along the progression of the plot. And this is usually centered around some kind of conflict. In most short stories, there is a central element of conflict, a single central element of conflict. We can talk about conflict as man versus man versus nature, man versus society, or man versus self. Stories also have a point of view. This is the perspective from which the story is told. There's first person point of view. This is when the author writes a story in which one of the characters participates in the story, and the character can describe what they're feeling and how they interact with the world around them, but they don't really have much insight into other characters and necessarily what they're feeling or thinking or what motivates them. Limited omniscience takes that one step further, where the narrative might include first person, but the author also allows the reader inside other characters' heads into their conscience, where you might have some idea of what motivates them and why they're doing the things that they do. Omniscient point of view goes even further, where the author loosely has the ability to weave in and out of all characters, discussing what they might be motivated by, what they might be thinking. The author might even go so far as to discuss the past, the present, and the future. Theme is another element of fiction. This is a central idea. It cannot be expressed in a single word. It's not necessarily the purpose of a work, the moral, or the conflict. A general statement, a theme is a general statement of the central underlying and controlling idea or insight a work provides. It's the idea that the writer wishes to convey about the subject, the writer's view of the world, or a revelation about human nature. And so always remember that a theme cannot be simply expressed in a single sentence. Symbolism is also something you may encounter in some of the short stories. In fact, you'll probably encounter it in all of them. So remember, a journey can symbolize life. Water may represent a new beginning. Black can represent evil or death. A lion, for instance, could symbolize courage. There are many symbols, and sometimes it takes a little bit of practice to be able to recognize them. There's many other fictional elements that we may discuss throughout this course. Allusion, that's a reference to a person, place, or literary, historical, artistic, or mythological source from some other place or time. Atmosphere is the prevailing emotional and mental climate of a piece of fiction, and dialogue, of course, is the reproduction of a conversation between two of the characters. There are other elements. Foreshadowing is an early clue about what will happen later in a piece of fiction. Irony is the difference between what is expected and reality. Style refers to a writer's individual and distinct way of writing, the total of the qualities to distinguish one author's writing from another. Structure might include chronological organization. Literature might include flashbacks, where the literature starts at the present but flashes back to a previous period of time. Literature can be described as circular or anticipatory in some cases, where a piece of literature may start in the present, flash back to the past, and then return to the present at the conclusion. There's also literature that's written as a panel. A good example of this would be The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner, where it's the same story told from different viewpoints from different characters. So that concludes my introductory video on basic elements of literature, especially the short story. If you have any questions as you move through this material, please remember that I'm always simply an email away. Thank you.